We made suits for every president in 3Gs, for every. But then I was responsible to see that they are made perfect. General Eisenhower, first suit, I made him. I met him when he liberated Buchenwald. So I shook his hand and I cried. But I said to him in German, I thought maybe he'll understand, you saved my life.
Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. In this episode, I'll be speaking with filmmaker Rick Minnich, writer and director of The President's Tailor, a documentary about celebrity tailor Martin Greenfield's remarkable story of how he went from surviving Auschwitz and Buchenwald to dressing some of the world's most famous and most powerful people, from former President Dwight Eisenhower to basketball great LeBron James. But before we dive into today's conversation, just one note: if you enjoy the program, subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. Well, GQ and Vanity Fair labeled him America's best tailor. Presidents from Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama to the gangster Meyer Lansky to stars like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jimmy Fallon, they all loved his work. For decades, Martin Greenfield made suits that famous men wore to further project their power. None, though, knew the origins of his expertise, accidentally ripping the collar off a guard's shirt in Auschwitz. From there, Martin realized that clothes possessed power, driving him to build America's most famous and successful custom suit company. It's how he went from arriving in the US with just $10 in his pocket to dressing 6 presidents and countless celebrities, coaching designers, and making thousands of suits for TV shows and movies. Hard work and, yes, determination. Because the last time he saw his father, Joseph, in Auschwitz, he said to Martin, "If you survive, you live for us." And that's exactly what he did. A new documentary, The President's Tailor, shares Martin Greenfield's amazing story of survival and success. I'm fortunate to have the film's writer and director, Rick Minnich, here with me today. We'll discuss Martin's extraordinary story of surviving concentration camps to becoming America's greatest men's tailor, as well as his life beyond the spotlight, including his successful family-run business and his relationship with his family. Rick Minnich is an American independent filmmaker based in Berlin, Germany. He's been writing, directing, and producing shorts and feature documentaries since 1993 with various German, European, and North American broadcasters, film funds, and production companies. And prior to working on The President's Tailor, his award-winning films include The Book of Lenins, Heaven on Earth, Forgetting Dad, and The Straight Guys. Rick, thanks for joining me today. Martin Greenfield's story is such a powerful one, and I'm really glad that you're here today to talk about him and about the film.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan.
You know, before we get started, I had mentioned to you before we went on that I've read about Martin Greenfield in the past, and usually it comes around the time of a presidential inauguration, and somebody will do a feature piece in one of the big newspapers about the president's suit. What is he wearing for the inauguration? And invariably, the story would come back to Martin Greenfield. And I have a personal interest as well, in the interest of full disclosure. I'm the grandson of a tailor who had a small shop near the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the 1920s, and was told by my dad that my grandfather occasionally would make a custom uniform, naval uniform, for one of the officers. So I really have taken a big interest in what you've done here to tell the story of Martin Greenfield. Now, before diving into your career and some of your past projects, let's start with your latest, which is the documentary on Martin Greenfield, The President's Tailor. What led you to your meeting with Martin, and how did you decide to create this documentary?
Well, this is kind of an unusual case for me. Usually I come up with some kind of idea and I look for a producer who goes out and finds the money and then we make the film. But in this case, it was a German journalist colleague of mine, Peter Hugo Schultz, who came to me with this idea. He was researching a completely different project at the Buchenwald Memorial. And the historian there said, hey, we had this teenager, Maximilian Grünfeld here, in 1945. I heard he immigrated to the United States and became a famous tailor. Maybe he'd be a great story for a film. So Hugo came to me and said, Rick, you're an American. Find this guy. So I did a little research, and it was not too difficult to find Greenfield Clothiers in Brooklyn. They have a website, and I just called the phone number and was talking to a man on the other line for a while. And then at some point he said to me, oh, I'm Martin's son, Jay. So I thought, I've hit the jackpot. And then I said to Jay, well, we want to make a film about you and your dad and the company, and we'd like to come visit you. And he said, sure, come on over. So about 2 months later, we took our first trip to Brooklyn, and that was in the spring of 2017. And I knew by the end of the first day that we were onto something. And I was absolutely certain by the end of the second day, after I met Martin's wife, Arlene, who was full of all kinds of wonderful stories, I said, okay, this is not only going to be a story about about a survivor and a famous tailor, this is going to be a family story, which is kind of a specialty of mine.
Well, can you share a bit about Martin as a person, particularly his outlook on life? Been through so much, particularly that experience as a teenager in concentration camps in Auschwitz. What was he like, and how do you think his personality developed, especially considering the challenges that he faced? The loss of family, lost all of his family in the Shoah, and the inhumane treatment that he endured, both inside and outside the camps. It's clear that he had the emotional strength to come to terms with, as much as possible, the adversity that he had endured, even though it probably took decades to do so. So tell us about the man.
Well, Martin had, first of all, anyone who ever got to meet him or anyone who sees the film, he had this inimitable smile that just was magnificent and radiated joy and made you feel immediately welcome in his presence, and that he was legitimately interested in who you are and getting to know you. So that was like something that I haven't often experienced in my life quite to that degree. The next thing was really his positive outlook, which you already mentioned. I'd say my experience with immigrants, I spent the first 22 years of my life in the US, and I met many immigrants to the US who were incredibly grateful for the opportunities that were offered to them. And many of them had escaped, had left pretty horrible situations in their home countries. So they had the incredible gratitude for every little thing that they were able to, that was given to them, every little bit of help, every little thing that they were able to achieve. And this was especially the case with Martin, because he literally lost his entire family and came pretty much penniless to the US. But he did have a distant relative who helped him out in the beginning, and other people who helped him out along the way. I think he basically realized he had a choice. He could either become a cynical, angry person who just blamed the war and the loss of his family for all everything bad in his life, or he could have taken the opposite approach and embraced all the opportunities given to him and build up a new life for himself. And he chose the latter, fortunately for all of us.
Well, for our viewers who aren't as familiar with Martin's incredible life, talk to us about the key moments in his life before he came to the United States. We talked about his being in concentration camps, but where was he born? What was his early life like? We've seen in clips I've seen of the documentary, a couple of photographs, a couple of family photographs, if I recall correctly. So what was his early life like, and what were the circumstances of his being interned in Auschwitz and then later in Buchenwald?
So Martin was born in Pavlova, in a village in the Carpathian Mountains. At the time, it was part of Czechoslovakia. Now it's part of Western Ukraine. And in the film, we go to this village with his son, Jay. Martin had two sons, Jay and Todd, who run the company now. And we go with Jay and Jay's two children and retrace Martin's path through Europe. So we started in Pavlova, in his hometown in Ukraine, where he grew up as one of four children in a very religious family. His grandfather taught at the temple, and he learned Hebrew and had a pretty traditional upbringing. When he was 14, he went to Budapest for an apprenticeship as an auto mechanic. And that's when he discovered that really that he was very good with his hands, that he liked to work with his hands. And that served him well when he, sadly enough, a year later ended up in Auschwitz and was working in the laundry room. And then that's where what you mentioned, where he was cleaning shirts for the Gestapo, and he accidentally ripped a collar and got beaten for it. But the Gestapo guy just threw the shirt at him, and Martin was able to keep the shirt. And he had a tailor there, a fellow prisoner who was a tailor, show him how to sew the collar back on. And this happened to Martin twice. And it actually was one of the things that saved his life, because he wore these shirts underneath his prisoner uniform, and they kept him extra warm. And he says, there were people just dying of the cold left and right of him. But in the death march, he had these 2 extra layers of clothing, and it's one of the things that helped him survive.
So towards the end of the war, he was transferred to Buchenwald.
Correct.
And so from there, it was a year to the end of the war, and then he was liberated.
Yes, he was transferred to Buchenwald in January of 1945. So he spent 5 months there, or 4 months there.
So now he's liberated, but what did he do? He must have been thinking about this, because based on what you've just said, about being good with his hands, he comes to a new country. Probably doesn't speak the language, but he's good with his hands, and he winds up where? I think I recall he was a floor boy. Is that what they called him?
Right.
In a garment shop?
First, he went to Baltimore because he had it was an uncle, I think on his mom's side of the family, who had already immigrated to the U.S. Someone he corresponded with in Yiddish, and who arranged for him sent him a ticket to take the ship, the steamer across to the U.S. So he started in Baltimore working in a furniture shop and didn't really like it so much. And a fellow survivor invited him to come to Brooklyn. This is someone who was working at the 3G's factory, which later became Greenfield Clothiers. So it was run by the 3 Goldman brothers. And one of the brothers took Martin under his wing, and quickly, Martin started as a floor boy, just moving things around the shop and taking things from here to there. But this one, Mr. Goldman, recognized that Martin was very talented. He was very keen to learn all 108 steps of making a suit jacket. And he built like little boxes for himself to organize all the little parts and things, and found ways to make the whole production process more efficient, so he wouldn't have to run around as much. And Mr. Goldman really liked that. And within a few months, he was promoted to shop supervisor. And then Mr. Goldman took him to Hollywood on a trip. He's like, you got to meet all these stars. And that's when Martin got a taste of, as a young man, for fame and luxury and this whole kind of world, which, quickly became his life.
But he must have had a good eye for fashion, because there were many tailors in those days, a lot of tailors, and probably many good ones who knew how to cut a pattern, to stitch, to do buttonholes, and all of those things that go into suit making. But there must have been, along with that trip to Hollywood, where I'm sure he saw many well-dressed people, kind of an eye for fashion, would you say?
Yes, I'd say he had an eye for fashion. I think Martin had like a sort of a rare combination. He was very good with his hands. So at technical side of making a suit. He was very good at that. He had an eye for style. He had an incredible charisma, and he was a good salesman. So I heard stories about how he would always, when he was traveling, he would always have some swatches with him. And by the time he'd get off of a flight, he'd sold several. Usually, he'd have a blue one and a gray one, and those are the two suits he would sell someone first. And he'd get off a flight having sold suits to the people sitting next to him. And he was just always he had that in him somehow. And where it came from, his father was an engineer. He didn't built bridges. He didn't come from a family of salespeople, but I think it was probably maybe just came out of his survival instinct. Before he went to the US, he spent 2 years wandering around Europe, lived in displaced persons camps and stuff, trying to find his father. He still had the hope that his father might still be alive. And it wasn't until someone from his village that he found by chance told him, hey, don't stop looking for your father. He was killed. The Nazis shot him in the head like a week before liberation. Then once Martin heard that story, and came into touch with this uncle in Baltimore, he realized that, he should seize this opportunity to go to the United States and start all over.
Again, going back to what we said a little bit earlier, there's something about separation and loss. And some people are able to cope and to build, and others are not. And it's certainly understandable, I think, in both cases. But let's go back now. So even if he had an eye for fashion, he also seems that he had a good idea about business. Now, he's done his apprenticeship at 3Gs. At what point did he say, I think I'd like to have my own business? How did that happen?
That kind of evolved naturally because the Goldman brothers just got older, and it became time to retire. And Martin had the opportunity to buy the company in 1977, and he seized that opportunity, figured out a way to finance it all, and that was the beginning of that. And then he pretty quickly decided to get his sons involved in the company. They were in their late 20s at the time. They had studied completely different, one was working in a theater as a stage manager. The other had trained to become a dentist, but they decided to join the company. I think Martin was very convincing. And he says that was the smartest move he ever made because together they kept the company in the family. And his sons were maybe a little bit, I think, better at the day-to-day operations. And Martin was really great with the customers. Everyone came to the company to see Martin. They wanted Martin to measure them. They wanted Martin to advise them on their suits. So Martin became more the figurehead of the company, and Jay and Todd kind of ran it quietly in the background.
So that brings me to the next logical question, which is, how did Martin earn the title the President's Tailor? Must be an interesting story here.
Well, he sort of by chance, the legend goes that Eisenhower liberated him from Buchenwald, which Martin likes to tell the story that he actually personally met Eisenhower. It's not totally clear if that's the case because Buchenwald had several subcamps, and it was actually a different subcamp that where Eisenhower personally appeared. But that's kind of beside the point. Eisenhower became his first customer, and that's because Eisenhower had a long-time relationship to the Goldman family. So when after the war, General Eisenhower came back to the United States and became the president of Columbia University. So before he became the president of the United States, he's the president of Columbia University. And at that time, he ordered some suits. And Martin had the idea that he would look great in a three-piece suit. And Mr. Goldman was skeptical, but Martin talked him into it. And they kind of made a deal that, okay, Martin could make him a three-piece suit, but if he didn't like it, it would be docked from Martin's salary. So Martin risked it and made that suit. And then he, at some point he started like putting notes in the pockets of the suits. And this was during the Suez Canal crisis. And Martin apparently gave Eisenhower some advice on how to solve the crisis there. And that story came out a bit later. But then, from one president to the next, Eisenhower became president of the United States. The Golden Brothers continued making suits for him, and then it went from one president to the next. And 6 in total, the Greenfields made suits. Martin made suits.
That is a record that will never be broken.
Probably not.
In the documentary, you film Martin's sons during their trip to Europe as they recount the story of their dad's life there. What did they say that stood out to you that was particularly poignant?
I was quite touched by a moment in Pavlova, in Martin's hometown, when we met an old woman on the street who recalled the story of the deportation. And I could tell that we had to go through an interpreter. She was speaking Ukrainian. We had an interpreter. So the story was kind of relayed, with a slight delay. And she told us the story of there were these 2 young girls about the same age as this woman who were also deported, and these beautiful young girls. And later, I think it clicked in Jay's mind that those 2 girls were probably his dad's sisters, who were also deported to Auschwitz and didn't make it back out. So that was a touching moment when I could see Jay kind of putting the pieces together of what this old woman was saying and how it related to his family. And not much later, a bit later that day, we were filming Jay on the street, Jay and his kids on the street, and Jay was kind of reflecting upon this moment about how some of the people in the village felt guilty about what happened and others not as much. And Jay kind of drew a conclusion to the situation today, what's going on in the world today. And that for me was really interesting, because I'm particularly fascinated by how the past affects people's lives today. And I could see that this Jay's retracing his father's steps was taking him back in time, but he was also trying to connect it to how it affected his life today. There was also a beautiful moment it's kind of hard to say a beautiful moment, but there was a touching moment at Auschwitz. So specifically, we were in Birkenau, which is like the famous part that you usually see with the gate, we arrived shortly before sunset, and it was just a beautiful day in the summertime. And there's a moment when Jay and his son David are reflecting upon how incredible it is that Martin survived it all. And it's a kind of, when you see the film, as a special moment between the 2 of them, and how their amazement at Martin and everything he accomplished after that, and a sense of deep gratitude that they became a part of it all. That Martin survived and had Jay and Todd, and that Jay had his son David, and that the whole family has stayed together.
Well, in many ways, Martin's life exemplified the classic story of immigration to America. But in others, it was truly a one-of-a-kind story. I'm curious, and you talk about the generations. I mean, that is the beauty of these stories, even in tragedy. That here is one person from a big family who managed to survive, makes his life in America, has a family, and not only does life go on, but generations now, new generations, working in the business. It is a classic American immigration story. Looking at his life and his legacy, and how the documentary portrays him, where do you hope viewers will look at this, or how would you like them to look at the film, and what would you like them to take away from it?
Well, I can just say that the experience so far, we had many screenings in New York City over the past weeks, and in Washington, Gig Harbor, Washington, played at a film festival. A lot of people came out of the screening with smiles on their faces because it's an inspiring film. Martin really just inspires a lot of people. His resilience, his ability to forgive and move on with his life. is something that a lot of people struggle with. And they see this old man, when we did most of the film, when we did the filming, he was like between 88 and 90. We filmed at his 90th birthday party. Was ending his career. It was COVID that finally forced him into retirement. They see someone, the film just gives people hope. And that's a great feeling for me as a filmmaker, that my film can put smiles on people's faces.
I saw something about him. I didn't meet him, but I saw something about him that came across very clearly in the documentary, and that was his humility. Mm. To make the suits for 6 American presidents, wow, that's quite something. And I suppose one could be forgiven for making sure that people know about that. But this intrinsic humility came through, and that impressed me so much. Would you say that was something that you found as well?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, there was a sense of humility, and he had a lot of pride in him too, but he didn't wear it on his collar, or so to speak. There's a nice little scene with his daughter-in-law, Bonnie, where she talks about how she came in there and kind of rearranged his desk and stuff. And he got very upset because what he really wanted on his desk was pictures of his family, of his new family, of the family he had created in his new life. And the pictures of the presidents, they were all like further away on cabinets in the office or on the wall behind him or something, but not really. He wanted to sit at his desk and see his family when he was opening his New York Times or whatever he was doing there. And for me, that's a really telling moment and one of the many funny moments in the film that reveal a lot about his character.
If you were to walk on the floor today, where they're cutting and sewing these suits, does the spirit of Martin Greenfield still infuse that location, that presence?
Absolutely, definitely. Martin talks about, he liked to talk about one of the big lessons he learned from Mr. Goldman is he instilled upon Martin that they produce quality with intrinsic value. And that really became Martin's motto. And the company has insisted that they have to produce a very high quality product that has a value in and of itself. And they've gone against the grain. They never open any retail stores. If you want a Greenfield suit, you have to go to the factory in Brooklyn and get fitted, and then you have to go, you get measured and come back for a fitting. There are many steps involved, but they want to make sure that each suit perfectly fits the customer and that the person feels really good in that suit. And I'd have to say, they made me a suit, and it's a very special feeling to wear a Greenfield suit.
I'll bet. Well, in a cookie cutter world, which is what we live in, it is certainly reassuring to know that the Greenfield factory is not only still there, but is prospering. Rick, where else are you planning to screen The President's Tailor? You mentioned a couple of places, so that it reaches the widest possible audience.
Well, the best place to look up where the film's playing is on our website. It's thepresidentstailor.com. We always post the latest screenings. We're going to have a screening at a film festival in New York City later this month. There's a screening at the St. Louis Film Festival in November, and then we're doing a whole tour of Florida in January and February at several Jewish film festivals and other venues. I can't yet say exactly which ones until they announce their official programs, but I will be going to Florida and we'll be touring around with the film. And I'm hoping that Jay or Todd, one of the sons, might be able to join me for part of the tour. When we had our screenings at the JCC in Manhattan a few weeks ago, and at the Hampton Synagogue, Martin's wife, Arlene, was there, and the sons, Jay and Todd, and the grandson, David, who's now working at the factory as well. They were all on stage with me, and for me, it was a beautiful experience to have Martin. I mean, it was sad that Martin couldn't be there with us, but we could really feel his spirit, and his whole family is in the film. So the audience got to ask them questions. They told stories, some beautiful stories I hadn't heard yet. I was kind of like, oh, I wish I had my camera. But it kind of yeah, it was a harmonious moment for me as a filmmaker, because it's not very often that I've had the opportunity to share the stage with people who are in the film. And for them, they always have just spent, a few days or a few weeks with me when we're filming. But for me, it takes me a long time to edit a film. So I might spend a year or two in an editing room, look at these people every day or almost every day. And they really become a part of my life. So when we all get to experience the film together in front of an audience, it's really kind of the most magical part of filmmaking for me.
Well, it's a great tribute to an American original. And The President's Tailor is the name of the documentary. Made its world premiere at the Jewish Film Festival Berlin-Brandenburg in June, and has screened at film festivals in New Zealand, Washington State, and in New York City, including at the IFC Center. You can learn more about the documentary, as Rick pointed out, at thepresidentstailor.com. Rick, thank you again for sharing Martin Greenfield's extraordinary story of surviving concentration camps to becoming arguably America's greatest men's tailor, and his message of tolerance and forgiveness. It's a beautiful film, and we're glad that you could be here to talk about it.
Thanks for having me. And I'd also like to add, we're looking to get the film onto PBS in 2025. And this is a great opportunity for your listeners to get involved. We're looking for underwriters to support the broadcast. So please get in touch with us through the website. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, this brings us to the end of another episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. A special thank you to Rick Minnich for discussing his film, The President's Tailor. And to you, our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, post about it on social media, or leave us a comment or a rating. For our latest content, and if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on the issues that matter most to the Jewish community and beyond. But until the next time, for my guest, Rick Minnich, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.